All right, so now that we've talked about overall things for the final, we've talked about questions we could ask for the exposition in an analysis. We've talked about things to look out for in the development in an analysis. Let's take a look at the recap, and let's not just ask what could we look at, because we really haven't talked too much about really how to analyze the recap beyond, oh, look, it should be the same as the exposition, just in the home key all the time. All right, let's get a little deeper and sort of see what's the recap there for, other than to just end the piece, right? That's sort of not a very satisfying analytical approach. Let's look at what's it doing, what are some of its purposes, what can a composer use the recap for, and let's also talk about, of course, what we might be looking for on an exam in an analysis of the recap. So let's go back to the score here. So where we left off, we got through a somewhat surprising development section, and we did this nice little circle of fifths. And then we got to 5, and then we were back. Right. And so the recap starts right here in measure 67. So I'm just going to write recap 67, and we know that the recap pretty much going to go through the end. It's possible, and we saw this in some people's projects, it's possible to have a coda at the end of a piece, but here's this is where I just want to remind you, thinking about for the exam, and I probably should have said this in the development video as well. Remember that I'm going to be asking you questions about the ways in which the piece conforms to the structure that we've learned about. I'm not looking to stump you, I'm not looking to surprise you, and so if we don't really talk about an element, like if we don't talk about a coda, for instance, if you're listening to the piece before really analyzing it, and you hear this stuff at the end and you say, man, that doesn't sound familiar at all, that sounds like it's not from the recap, oh my goodness, he's going to ask about this, I don't know what to say because we didn't learn about it. I'm not going to ask about it, right? If there's something surprising there, I'm not interested in that. I'm not looking for you to have to sort of figure that out on your own, okay? So for our purposes, we're going to assume the recap goes to the very end, which in this piece it does, but in some maybe it doesn't, and if it doesn't, don't worry about it because I'm probably not going to ask about something that we haven't really talked about. Okay, so again, always got to put the disclaimer on with any section of a sonata. What are the things that I could ask about at any given time? Could always be interested in knowing about what key we're in. Now, for the recap, that should be a really simple answer. So that's actually something that I definitely might ask about to just confirm where are we tonally in the recap. Especially that's something you want to be thinking about for identifying the beginning of the recap, right? The main theme is stated in the home key. The main theme will not be stated in the home key before the recap. It just won't. That's the definition of where the recap begins, where the recapitulation begins, is when the home key, we return to the home key and we hear the main theme again. So that's really, really critical. And we're going to stay in that key pretty, unless something really wild happens for the rest of the recap. We always want to be thinking about sort of where we are hearing material from. Where have we heard, where are we hearing material from before? And again, for the recap, that should be very straightforward because we should be hearing a restatement of all the things that we had in the exposition. And it's that comparison that's going to be really central to what's going on. We always want to be looking out, of course, for cadences. And that's another thing where, since the exposition is a very structured part of the piece, we should have a lot of information that we can use to compare the recap from the exposition in terms of cadences. And then the last thing that really could come up almost anywhere is to look at analyzing some of the harmonies. The recap, in my mind, is a really good place to analyze chords because, again, we should know pretty much what key we're in at any given time, especially in the recap, right? The development, we know by definition, the development kind of meanders and isn't always clearly in a key or is in a key maybe we don't expect it to be. The recap is in the home key. So if I were you, I might be sort of thinking about getting ready to analyze some chords in the recap because we should be pretty certain we know what key we're in. Okay, so those are just those big picture things. Now, let's analyze this recap and along the way investigate some more recap-specific things to be talking about. So, the big picture idea with the recap is we can use the recap to confirm question mark spots that we may have had in the exposition. So if we go back to the exposition of this piece, you may recall that we've got this main theme, and I happened to put the box around it here, which is in fact where the main theme is in this piece. But much like many other pieces, this one starts, right? And then 4 measures later, or after a statement, measure 5 here, we have this. And we can be saying, oh my goodness, this is so hard to know if the main theme is continuing and we're just sort of, it's a long main theme that does kind of the same thing twice at the beginning, or is this the beginning of the transition? And in a lot of pieces, that's really hard to tell. I just want to remind you that it is extremely common for the transition to begin with a statement of the main theme again in the home key, so just extremely common. But the beauty is, if we know that the recap is a place where we can often search for answers to confusion from the exposition, we can do a little comparison. So we've got our main theme, 4 measures long, 1, 2, 3, 4. We kind of have this nice little cadence here, just sort of tiny little cadence here, not really much coming on here, but getting back to G on beat 3 of the 4th measure. And then we restate again. And our question here is this the beginning of the transition, just restating the main theme, or is this part of the main theme section and we're still chugging along? And what we can do is look at this and then compare how it is in this same spot in the recap. So if we look here, we start out, right, we got our little thing just an octave higher, right? And then D, C, B, basically the same exact thing. You can see the left hand is just a little bit more figured, right? But nothing really significant, because if you look here, got it. B, B, A, G, F sharp, right? B, A, G, F sharp, D, right? So even though there's eighth notes, even though it's an octave higher, look, it's in treble clef now. It's the same music, right? And so again, we get the ending of this idea same way that we had the main theme end, with a D, C, B, and an E, F sharp, G in the left hand, right? So now let's go back to the recap and see if we still have this same confusion. Okay, here's the beginning of the recap, measure 67, right? Right, we're doing our same thing. And here's our little cadence. And now we've repeated an octave higher now. So here's measure 1. Here's measure 1 of our, is this the main theme or is this the transition question mark section? Here's measure 1 of it. Right, we got our thing. And look, again, same thing. Same figured eighth note thing. And then look what happens here, 73. This is the 3rd measure. Oops, sorry. And what happens here? We're off into something new here. So that happens in the 4th measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now remember, in the 4th measure of this, are we in the main theme? Are we in the transition idea? In the exposition, we did the melody. Here's measure 2. And we had D, C, B. Right? We can even go back just to check. Measure 1, 2, 3. D, C, B. It ended the same way as the main theme proper. Now here, 2, 3, and we're off. That does not match up. So you have to be really careful to notice these subtle changes, because if you do notice it, you can start to find really, really convincing arguments for why, yeah, the main theme is only 4 measures long, right? So if I was sort of going to be putting my rectangle here, again, I got to change this. If I was putting a rectangle here, I should have looked at this beforehand. I would have this measure in it for the main theme, right? That's going to be continued down through here, through D, da, da, right? Through basically here. It doesn't matter if you put these notes in it or not. They're kind of just a pickup into that next thing. So the main theme of the recap is 67 through 70. And it's because we noticed that here we have a change. It does not match up with what we had in the exposition, that we can clearly say that the transition starts in measure 71 and goes off, right? So again, even if you're only analyzing the exposition, you can look forward and compare the lengths of the sections to sort of see where the change happens, right? Because it's really, really important to remember that since the recapitulation is not going to modulate, things can happen different. Things can be different. Things can happen differently. And the place that often carries that difference the most clearly is the transition, because it's the section that does not have the same job to do, right? The main theme should be exactly the same. Sometimes you'll find that a composer dresses the main theme up a little bit more in the recap, but the structural elements are identical. In this case, it's the same, right? It's literally the same. And the transition starts with the main theme again, but just before it left us uncertain, in the 4th measure of the transition, it's off into a new direction, and we can really be so certain that this is the transition that's doing a very common transition thing and stating the main theme again in the home key at the very beginning, but it's the transition, not the main theme. All right? So that's one big thing to look out for in the recap. Use the differences from the exposition to clarify confusing things about the form. All right? Okay. So that's number 1. So again, as you're analyzing this, you basically want to be going through and just noticing how things line up with the exposition. If you had no big questions in the exposition, first of all, congratulations, that's awesome. Second of all, that means that your job in analyzing the recap is pretty much just lining things up. There still may be, in pieces that don't offer much confusion, there still may be differences. You'll often find that in the recap, a composer is often a little bit more succinct with how they say things, how they approach things. In the exposition, it's all brand new material, right? And so you might find sort of a little bit more elaboration on ideas, whereas in the recap, it doesn't need to be done in quite as flowery a way. So you'll often find that some sections are a little shorter. Even the main theme might be a couple measures shorter, depending on the piece. But that's something to look out for. Now, so you're just analyzing the sections. The next big picture idea that you want to be thinking about in the same line with the recap is what happens with the transition. Because this is where there is almost guaranteed going to be a change, right? Almost guaranteed, because in the exposition, that transition needs to modulate. So the way a composer deals with that in the recap is really notable. And so a very likely question that I might ask in a recap would be something like, compare the transition from the expo to the recap. Let's move that where we can actually read it. So some version, I always love bringing it out of the music to see where my spelling has majorly let me down. Compare the transition from the expo to the recap. And I may do this, I may ask this in a bunch of different ways. I probably would like to ask it in two ways. So one question would be something like, describe a way that the transition is the same as the transition in the recap is the same as the transition in the exposition. Like, tell me one way that it is the same. And so let's sort of think about this one. What could we say about that? What could we say about a way that the transition is the same between the exposition and the recap? Well, my first sort of gut reaction here is that I would want to point out that in both cases it uses a statement of the main theme, right? Sort of uses statement of main theme just like expo, right? Just like the exposition. And we're even going to use a statement, not a statment. Uses a statement of the main theme just like the exposition, right? That's really noteworthy. So if you were thinking about ways that a transition section is the same between the exposition and the recap, that's a pretty good one. That's something to point out for sure. But then I might say, what's a way that the transition is different from the exposition to the recapitulation? And this is where you have to dig a little deeper. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that I really, really, really want to discourage you from accidentally using the same thing for both answers, right? So what I found is if I ask this question twice, I often have people who somehow find a way to sort of contradict themselves by using the same example, the same thing in both things. So like this would be a good example here. Somebody might say, this is a tiny little example, but I'm going to use it anyway. Somebody might say, okay, well, what's one way it's the same? Uses the main theme. Awesome. What's one way it's different? Okay, when using the main theme, the composer starts this with 3/8 notes at the beginning of the measure instead of just 2. People have found ways to just be very, 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 very nuanced in such a way that it does not help them. So make sure that when you're answering what's the same and what's different, you use different measures to describe that, or different parts of the transition, different aspects of the transition to answer that question, okay? That would be something very important. And there's really two main ways that you can deal with this difference. Or these are the things that I'm really trying to get at and that I think are the most important. So number one, the big, big, big thing here is that it does not modulate in the recap. The transition is going to stay in the home key. So if you're looking for the most important structural distinction between the transition from the exposition to the transition in the recap, describing the way that it manages to stay in the home key is by far the most important thing you can be looking for. And so here we're in G major. In the exposition, this transition modulated to D major, right? So here you might want to be looking for ways that it does not do that. Good example, look here, it sort of pulls around and it's does like a 5/4 thing, highlights C a little bit, which of course is very distinct from motion to D major, so that's pretty notable. But that kind of motion, look here, we've got G dominant 7th chords. These are obviously still pointing towards C, which is a little strange because you'd think, well, I thought the whole idea is that we're supposed to be singing G. But highlighting other harmonies is actually a sneaky way that a composer can not modulate, because by pointing towards C, Beethoven here is making absolutely sure that he's not going to go to D, right? Subtle little thing. Another thing that connects with that, which I would say is sort of the 1B of the really critical ways in which a transition is different or can be different, is oftentimes the type of cadence that we have is distinct. This is a unique one. So if we look here, actually a lot of this transition, especially once we get to here, a lot of this transition, once we get to like 80, feels really similar with this, like, right? This kind of triplety thing with the left hand, right? Got again this sort of standing on the dominant kind of thing. The difference here, though, is that when Beethoven uses this figure in the recap, we are in G major. So this truly is standing on the dominant. And what happens is we can look at the ending here, and look, we end on D. What in the exposition was an authentic cadence on 1 is now a half cadence on 5. And so the same note, D, that ended both sections, is sort of playing a little bit of a dual role. It's kind of sneaky. By using similar material but a less modulatory motion to it, Beethoven highlights the fact that the exposition, it hinges on this cadence in D at the middle, right? It's 5 of the home key. But here, not only is it 5 of the home key, it's just 5 in the home key. It's a 5 chord. It's a half cadence. So a really interesting thing that you might point out in this one is that Beethoven can use the same chord to be a different cadence. So instead of ending on an authentic cadence in D at the end of the transition, Beethoven ends on a half cadence in G. Still on D, but we can sort of put that it's 5 here and that this is a half cadence. That's something that I think is really a subtle beauty of this structure here. And then we're into the ska section, and this is the first time that we hear these themes in G, right? And this is just the last little thing that I want to point out that I think often happens, and this happens to be one that I think is very particularly Beethoven-y. Composers often fix little things in the recap. And so if you noticed in the exposition, Beethoven actually does a bunch of motion which has this. And if you were sort of listening to that, you would have noticed that that's a 2-1 motion, which, and you know from many semesters of theory with me, nothing good comes from 2 to 1. You'll often end up with me writing something like 2 doesn't go to 1 and just sort of plopping it down there. That's sort of very common. Now, this 2 to 1 thing actually happens a lot in Beethoven, which is kind of why I want to point it out. So if we keep going on here, find that Beethoven is really stuck on this. He's doing this octave thing. He does the same theme up an octave. And here we go. We get this 2 to 1 again. But look what Beethoven does. He adds, we get both of them in the screen here. He adds an F sharp to the left hand, which is the leading tone of G. So he actually makes this 2 to 1 progression turn into a 7 to 1 progression. And as we know, 7 very much wants to go to 1. It's just one of those little subtle things. I'm not saying that you need to pick up on these little nuanced details like this, but this is just a tiny, tiny example of the big picture idea that in the recap, the composer puts things in order, puts them the way they were meant to be, whether that's a tiny little progression fix, quote-unquote fix like this, or whether it's showing us the way that this cadence is really a half cadence, or that this material was sort of put here to work as a half cadence in the recap, or whether it is to clarify the form, sort of make things right by finally hearing things in the home key, by clarifying tonal relationships, by clarifying structural elements. That's what the recap is about. And so you want to be ready to go deeper than just saying, well, it's just same as the exposition, here we go. But be looking for these ways that it's different from the exposition, because oftentimes the way that it's different is the composer sort of fixing something or putting something in order the way it was meant to be. So that's a look at the recap in this Beethoven piece, and I hope that gives you a really good feel for the way that your exposition knowledge can combine with some analytical looking in the recap to give you a really nice approach to analysis.